Well, good evening, Saints. Welcome to our conversation about the Christian role and responsibility in regards to policing. My name is Lana Heath de Martinez. My pronouns are she and her. I'm an orphan pastor. I have no denominational home or certificate of ordination. I sit in coffee shops and detention centers and at homes and parks. People come and we share space. My call is at the intersection of church and immigration and criminalization. The Spirit is speaking to us from the panelists, from the pulpits, and most of all from the streets in these times. I'm here tonight because I believe that we collectively as the church can and must do better, and I believe that we will. As we gather on occupied lands, the land I stand on belongs to the Powhatan, Pamunkey, Appomattox, Chickahominy, and many other peoples and nations. We find ourselves at a moment of reckoning. To echo Reverend Barber of the Poor People's Campaign, someone is hurting my people and it has gone on far too long. George Floyd is but one of many hashtags arising from stolen human lives. His killing has forced us to this moment of reckoning. The police officer, Derek Chauvin, who knelt on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 45 seconds, was also involved in the murder of an Indigenous man, Wayne Reyes, in Minnesota in 2006. Chauvin was also involved in multiple uses of force against Black and Indigenous people that have been officially investigated, 19 as I recall. Derek Chauvin is the problem, and he is not the problem. Even with multiple investigations, Derek Chauvin remained a police officer until 1 month ago. The violence of policing is not an individual issue, but one of collective sin. We live on a continent that has been the site of white Christian imperial violence for nearly 500 years. In 1526, the first Europeans mapped the coast of Virginia. This was a place of communities for millennia. And colonizers found many autonomous communities and immediately judged them less than human, only valuable as sources of free labor and victims to abuse. Europeans brought disease and violence. They exploited kindness and resources, engaged in genocide and forced removal from native homes. Today, our policies here and abroad continue to forcibly displace and violently kill Indigenous communities throughout the world. Many who flee violence that the United States has created are again forcibly displaced through deportation and subject to disease in detention centers. In 1619, the first Africans were brought to Virginia in chains. They too were forcibly removed from their homelands, ravaged by disease bestowed upon them by Europeans, murdered and exploited for their labor for the gruesome purposes of chattel slavery, cementing the hold of white supremacy and capitalism over us all. New England settlers appointed Indian constables to police Native Americans. This is from the National Constable Association. The St. Louis police were founded to protect residents from Native Americans in that frontier city, and many Southern police departments began as slave patrols. In 1704, the colony of Carolina developed the nation's first slave patrol. Slave patrols and Indian night watches became today's police forces. These continue to use violence to enforce racist laws and protect the property of the white elite. This violence continues through gentrification, the prison industrial complex, police brutality, legal codes written and passed into law, an inaccessible healthcare system, a segregated public education system that erases and dismisses the systemic violence wrought upon our forebears and contemporaries who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We are in a moment of reckoning, and that is the beginning of repentance. Our scriptures cry, shuv, turn back and look the truth in the face. Turn back and recognize the harm that has been done. Turn back and see what has been broken. Turn back and do not continue until that which has been broken has been made whole again. As we enter into this reckoning, we call to mind the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail. In the letter, King describes how white moderates prefer a negative peace, the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. Saints, we must sojourn through that tension of this reckoning if we ever want to abide in the peace that is justice. Tonight finds us here at the beginning of our journey toward mutual equitable relationships with one another and with creation. Before we move into our panelist discussion, we want to review a few terms. You may have heard before, reform the police. Reforming the police is generally falls within the paradigm of believing that the agency, the specific police department, is inherently moral or amoral, but not immoral. Reforming the police believes that changing the agency through creating new policies and procedures, including training requirements, accountability and oversight, and how force is used, can correct the system of violence that we've seen. Defunding the police. Calls to defund the police fall within the belief that the agency is inherently immoral, but can essentially be rebuilt with moral limitations. This begins usually with demilitarization, stripping away the budget of local police departments to the minimum required to deal with a new mission, which again is limited in scope. It limits the police involvement in everyday life of the community while reallocating those resources to things like education. And then you have calls to abolish the police. People who call for abolishing the police typically believe that the institution of policing, not the individual officers, not the Richmond Police Department, but the institution of policing itself is inherently immoral. It includes all agencies such as ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, and typically begins with defunding, steadily reallocating the resources into a restorative justice framework. Many calls to defund the police are moving towards abolishing the police. This does not mean anarchy. This does not mean there will be no agency for public safety. In fact, many communities that have historically been impacted by the violence of policing as an institution have created alternative models for public safety that use a frame of restorative justice. And perhaps that is a conversation for the next event in the series. So at this time, I will turn it over to Dr. Jones.
Welcome, everyone. We are so excited that you are here for this important conversation. Our topic is how can Christians respond to unjust policing? And this is a series of conversations that are sponsored or hosted by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, as well as the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. I want to start by first thanking Lana for her introduction and kind of putting in a frame of reference this reality of repenting for a broken system, but also moving to a process of repairing, and the context of these terms: defund the police, abolish the police, reform the police, and so forth. I do believe that the police killings of George Floyd and other Black Americans have reignited our dialogue about policing in the US. And we are asking the questions, how can the Bible and theology speak to these issues of immorality and racism in law enforcement? How can people of faith bear witness to an unjust system, but also advocate for change? Our goal for this conversation is to put in tension the challenges of policing with the Christian tradition. So we have some panelists here, and I'm going to ask that you introduce yourself with your name, background, and then what brought you to this conversation. Dr. Lightsey?
Thank you so much, Reverend Jones, for the helping to lead us in this conversation, and also to Lena as well. I am the Vice President of Academic Affairs at Meadville Lombard Theological School located in Chicago. I'm also a scholar with expertise in the area of just war, classical and contemporary just war theory, as well as queer theory and queer theology. This conversation is one of interest to me. I've written several articles on violence, particularly just war. My most recent article is entitled Blinking Red: The Escalation of a Militarized Police Force and Its Challenges to Black Communities. That chapter is located in a book that is entitled Feminist Militarism, Post-Colonial and Decolonial by Ann Joe. It can be found on Amazon. Shameless plug there. But needless to say, I've been working in this area for quite some time. I'm a woman and scholar, so I'm particularly interested in the well-being of Black communities across the nation. So I thank you all for the invitation to share and to hear, so that not only our local communities, but that our nation can eradicate this plague that is in our midst.
Reverend Alex or Dr. Wary, please introduce yourself. Mm-hmm.
My name is Alec Evans, and I serve as the pastor of Second Presbyterian Church for the last 12 years in downtown Richmond. I'm a graduate of Union Seminary. I'm also a former board member, and I'm privileged that Union is hosting this conversation tonight. It's an important one. I think I'm part of this conversation because while I've been a pastor, a local church pastor for more than 30 years, about 15 years ago, I got invited when I was in my former church, Blacksburg Presbyterian Church in Blacksburg, Virginia, to become their volunteer police chaplain. A lot of things transpired in Blacksburg soon after they asked me to be the chaplain, including some shootings of police officers, and then the major shootings on the campus of Virginia Tech. So I found myself in the middle of that, and following that, I, with the encouragement of another Union Seminary grad, Eric Skidmore from South Carolina, one of my good friends and former colleagues at the seminary, we started the Virginia Law Enforcement Assistance Program that existed to help police officers who had been in trauma. And it started with about 50 officers who'd been on the scene at the major shooting at Virginia Tech. And since then, we've been hosting police seminars, post-critical incident seminars only for police officers who've been in the midst of trauma from the violence of our culture. We've had officers from the Virginia Tech shooting, the officers from the Sandy Hook school shooting, officers from the Pulse nightclub shooting, and just last year, officers from the municipal building shooting at Virginia Beach. So my life has been very much as a parish pastor, but also affected deeply by trying to provide care, encouragement, and traumatic help for traumatized police officers through Virginia Law Enforcement Assistance Program, which I still am the convening director. So we continue with that work in these days. This is a very important conversation, and I'm honored to be a part of it. Thank you.
Dr. Wary?
Thank you, Dr. Jones, and thank you, Sister Martinez, for introducing me to this forum. I'm just very honored to be a part of the conversation. And I want to say that my experience for the past, I guess, almost 40 years now has been as a pastor, leading people, serving people in disinvested communities largely, though I spent a long stint in a downtown church in Norfolk. I come to the conversation, I suppose, through that lens. I look at the conversation through that lens. I'm also very, very active, have been very active as a pastoral anthropologist, in the sense that I help churches to usher in relationship with disinvested communities, and as well have done a lot of work in social justice and activism in the communities that I've served, including this one here in Charlotte, and have been instrumental with the Charlotte Interfaith clergy in crafting a set of demands for change to avoid tinkering around the edges as we've seen for so many years. I consider myself a student of the zeitgeist and try to discern the times wherever I serve. That's one of the reasons I'm here today.
Lana, I know you've spoken already, but I do want to make space for you to introduce yourself again.
I'll just share briefly that my life's work and passion right now, it goes into organization I co-founded with several comrades last year called Santos in Virginia. We're a legal defense and bail fund, excuse me, too much coffee. And we're a strictly abolitionist fund. So we envision a world where we don't have prisons as they currently exist, and we don't have police as they currently exist, but we could make room for a new imagination of a restorative justice model. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We have not only a diverse group of folks who are gathered with us here, but also hopefully varying perspectives and ways of input and connecting and sharing. For those who've joined with us before, this, I believe, is our third webinar. And from feedback, we've adjusted our format tonight just a bit to allow more time for more time for viewer questions, your questions, to our panelists. So kindly submit those in the Q&A box if you're on Zoom or in Facebook comments, and we'll try to answer as many as we can during our gathered time here. We are going to jump right into our questions without delay. And so I think Lana brilliantly outlined that the institution of policing in the United States has a history in slave catching and capturing and even seeking control of marginalized bodies, peoples, and communities. My opening question tonight is, how do we discuss, or how has the history of white Christian supremacy informed the institution of policing in the US?
I'll start us. So I'll jump in the water, because I find this question rather interesting, the way that it's phrased. The term, white Christian supremacy, when we very often speak about white supremacy. So I believe there's some intentionality on you all's part to insert Christianity here. And I think you're helping, I think you're trying to get us to see how Christianity has been complicit in the policing, particularly Black bodies, but also brown bodies and Native American bodies in the history of our nation. And so in some ways, I'm saying that in order to begin the discussion, we need to have some working definition among everyone who is speaking. And to that end, the working framework that you all have placed for us is the attention to Christianity and its complicity in policing. That is not, for me as a theologian, that's not unusual, because the canon itself, the biblical text, was that instrument, that resource that was utilized to keep Africans enslaved in America. Sacred scripture was used to justify slavery, and used in ways that made white Christians comfortable with this evil and sinful institution. And so we can't remove Christianity from white supremacy. Christianity is also involved in the origins of the Ku Klux Klan. And so we have to hold Christianity's feet to the fire. It's not a pure faith. It has a history of its leaders and its hierarchy doing very evil things. And so if we start there, maybe we can branch out, and let's not hold, I'm assuming that's what you all want, is that we not hold Christianity as innocent, but as complicit in the things that are going on, what has brought us to this day and time. So that's my entrance.
So I will co-sign what Dr. Lightsey has put forward and say that I think that, as the term is, white Christian supremacy has been nurtured by, as she also said, the very introduction of Christianity to enslaved people, for example, during the Second Great Awakening, and has been used as a bludgeon, and sometimes as a cudgel, and sometimes as a gate, and sometimes as a corral, for the ambitions and the dreams of oppressed people, Black and Brown and First Nation people, but also a self-perpetuating oppression has taken place, using white Christianity as the background music for all kinds of dastardly public policy. So I think that there's a nexus between what was born in the slave patrols as the result of the slave patrols. There is a nexus between what was born there and the evolution of those impulses and oppressions into public policy, so that the very rules of the road for people to eke out a life in the country and have developed into things as are outlined in, for example, Rothstein's book, The Color of Law. So there's a gossamer thread, sometimes a crimson thread, I guess a blood red thread, between the origins of Christianity in African American contexts to the deadly public policy which resulted in the death of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, which, I guess we could talk at another time, were the flint, the catalyst of the movements we see in the streets and in various cities.
I just wanted to take the conversation even back a little bit further to how Europeans ended up on this continent and the ways that the institutional church was complicit with that move. We have the doctrine of discovery and the whole concept of manifest destiny, right? And so this came from the institutional hierarchical church and funded these voyages to the new world, quote unquote, and then gave people kind of carte blanche permission to throw people off their land, steal their land, and murder them, forcibly displacing people and exploiting their bodies for labor and other horrible uses. And so when this is the beginning, and this authority comes from the institutional church, and then you have the Indian Night Watches and the slave patrols formed, which are, with the case of the Indian Night Watches, they're formed by these communities that have forcibly displaced people after stealing their land. And then they're formed because the community that is now settling there, these settler colonizers, are afraid that the people they have forcibly displaced are going to come back. And so this is why those night watches were formed. Likewise, the slave patrols that were formed in the southern states, these were formed with the explicit purpose of returning what was seen as property of the white elite. So in both of these cases, we're dealing with human bodies that have been displaced, human bodies that have been exploited, and the whole concept of protecting white elite property. And with that being the explicit mandates, that is why people in kind of my school of thought would say we need to abolish the police in order to have a new system that's restorative. So that's my perspective on the question.
So could I mention to, and Lana, I mean, is dead on point, that this does have a deeper connection. Robert Hood, for example, in Begrimed in Black, mentions the systemic theological, I would say, bastardization of Christian doctrine to relegate Black people to soulless beings,
Mm-hmm.
and particularly defined their right to, to colonize and to pillage and to despoil, to that soullessness, and even syncretized it into the whole gospel mission of redeeming the infidel. And that basis, I think that very sardonic basis is not, as far away as it is, should not be underestimated in terms of the righteous right that seems to be claimed by law enforcement to, through qualified immunity and other things, have absolute impunity to barbarize and mistreat and kill.
And yet, I want to add one other thing, just to piggyback on what Peter has said. Not only that, but that the Black people, Africans, though the text was used against them, okay, it was also the doctrines of the church. So the right of baptism was denied to Africans because one does not baptize one's property, that which is considered an animal. So the right of baptism was denied so that the slave owners would have the comfort of continuing this horrible institution without any regard for the human being. So the idea that we're all born and we're all, created in the image of God, the Imago Dei, was dispatched with in the case of those who were enslaved for the comfort of slave owners. And we can talk about white Christian supremacy, but to speak more broadly, white supremacy has its tentacles in so much of public policy, the history of public policy in America, and also the history of medical practice in America, that it's very hard to disentangle it. The fact that we have chaplains who serve in police on police forces, chaplains in the military. This is all part of this kind of intersections, these kind of connections in this institution itself. So we can't dismiss. The slave that ran away was considered sick, had a disease called drapetomania. Because why would they leave the plantation where they had everything so good? So you have the beginnings of the medicalization of deviance in America. So all these things work together.
So we have a question that's come from Zoom, and the question is, how can we convey to predominant white middle-class congregations the urgent need to address unjust policing? Again, that's how can we convey to the predominant white middle-class congregations the urgent need to address unjust policing?
Maybe I can try to answer that because I serve a predominantly white middle-class congregation. I think the people of my congregation are real aware of the significance of these days. I think a lot has become really clear in the horrific images of George Floyd and the news of Brianna and other situations recently, reminding us that we have a lot of work to do related to our culture. And I think the police and police brutality is just symptomatic of that. It's just the most vivid depiction of how bad we need to address it. So I think it's an easy sell for the people that I preach and teach and try to pastor. Most of them are totally open to this conversation and attentive to the needs. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have a lot of work to do in the broader culture, because we got leadership and others who are singing other tunes, and we have a long way to go. So I just know that in my church, this is an important and focused conversation.
So I think that a really a nouthetic, a straightforward dialogue and conversation needs to happen, but not talk alone. What we discovered, Dr. Ben Boswell and I, when we took a bus full of our own church members on a civil rights tour through the South. We started in Atlanta. When we left Charlotte, we had a study guide to go along with it to kind of guide the deliberations. One of the things we discovered were lots of tears and lots of anger from our white family on the bus. And they were angry and tearful because as we discovered, and for some of us for the first time, and some of us relived the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow and so on, they were angry and sad because their families and churches had protected them from even knowing about a lot of these incidents. And so I think that constructive, very forthright conversation, but merged with as much a determined action on the part of our white family to address these issues as on the part of those undergoing the struggle as Black people, brown people. Those two things must marry. And I think that's the gateway to beginning the march towards sanity.
And I think pastors as leaders need to be, I don't want to say courageous, but they need to be in touch with their own sense of humanity to lead those conversations and not step away from them. A term that I've learned over the last year is the purple church. Purple church, which is a healthy mixture of conservative, very right-wing parishioners who can make life miserable for a pastor. And I'm struck by that because I thought that, you know, my sense of ministry, I'm ordained in the United Methodist Church. We talk about risk-taking ministry. And if there were ever a time where pastors needed to be prophetic, to cry out and spare not, now is the time to do that, even to be willing to place one's credentials and one's livelihood on the line. We just cannot be silent in the midst of this evil.
I think there's a real movement of the Spirit in these days that people are seeing. How can you not speak to it? We've been talking about it every single Sunday at my church. I think it's what we have to do. So we're in the middle of celebrating 175 years, and our church was led for the first 54 years by a strong Confederate who was friends with Jefferson Davis and left town in Richmond when Jefferson Davis fled. I mean, we're trying to own this and look beyond this to say, this is not what God would call us to be about. We see it in a different way, and we're trying to be honest about that, speak to it, and speak to police brutality and all these things that are on the forefront right now. We can't not do it.
I think the challenge comes when, again, this is a matter of defining and really getting to a common thread of, and when it comes to language. So when we talk about such things as rule of law, this is where I see things begin to fall apart, because those things that I've heard white people speak about with regards to rule of law whenever a Black person is harmed, the quick demonizing that comes forth is stunning, and how the justification for that person being harmed by police. I feared for my life. This person stole something. If they would not have run, so on and so forth. Those things are brought up under the framework of rule of law. It's a comfort zone. if we're honest, it's a comfort zone for many white Americans. It's a comfort zone, and it is a luxury that Black people don't have. And unless we get to that point where we recognize the rule of law has not treated Black and Brown and Native Americans well. I mean, we would just look at Mount Rushmore. Our Native American had to stand there and say, this isn't even in your land. You won't even honor the treaty agreement. So we're far apart there. And we've got to get to some kind of common ground if we're going to have a discussion. And in some cases, we need to be honest and say we might not be able to get to that common ground.
We have another question. Oh, Lana, go ahead. Yes.
Just very quickly, I think what I'd like to see congregations doing is interrogating who's safe in their space and whose voices are centered. Because so often when we think about going into a sanctuary, it's not really safe for everybody. It's not inclusive of everyone. And it's certainly not attending to the most marginalized folks who may have something to share or to say. And so, my agency does this. Many agencies do allied trainings and accomplice trainings. And it's all about understanding whose voices we need to hear. And I think that the church as an institution that has some moral authority in our society, when the church stands up to say, these are the voices that should be listened to, then that really does put the onus on the people in the pews to pay attention and adds more weight to those words.
We have another question. Is police reform possible without addressing the proliferation of guns in this nation? Is police reform possible without addressing the proliferation of guns in this nation?
Not at all.
I don't think so. I think they absolutely have to go together. And we haven't had much talk about that. In fact, we live in such a violent culture. I mean, police know that when they are going to confront somebody, they're likely to find a gun. It's just how many guns are in our culture. There was an article in the paper yesterday of how many thousands have been purchased just in June in Virginia, a record setting. So I think there's no way to talk about these without talking about both of them, policing and gun violence.
And I mean, not just the guns that are in the neighborhoods, but the kinds of equipment that the police have themselves. Program 1033, which is a congressional program that allows police to be in our neighborhoods with militarized equipment, is governed and sanctioned by law. So, and as quiet as it's kept, some of the guns in our neighborhood are there because of corrupt police. So, we have to look at it from all avenues.
And I think that we have to be honest in the debate about the symbology of guns in the abstract, the deification, for example, of the Second Amendment, which has become code language for vigilantes and white supremacists, and that with each episode of racial animus and tension in the country, an upsurge in gun purchases happens. It's almost another dog whistle that is sent as a shot across the bow, a warning to Black and brown people. I'll never forget, at the inauguration of Barack Obama, I got stranded in an airport. My mother-in-law stranded in an airport, and I'd gone away to get something to drink, and she was sitting there behind two white guys who made it a point to sotto voce, but just so she could hear it, detail how they were stockpiling weapons in the swamps of Suffolk. Suffolk is, her ancestral home. This has to become a conversation, and there must be courage of conviction on the part of elected officials to address this and kill this beast of violence and militarization. And Dr. Lightsey, I couldn't agree more with regard to the 1033 program, because over-militarized policing is one of the reasons why we are having the conversation even about abolishing police or defunding police, or in our sense, reimagining police.
And I just want to add transparency. I say this as a veteran. I'm a military veteran. My son served in Iraq. My family lived overseas and we served. So that's the transparency that I also bring to this conversation. I think we have too many, there are too many weapons in our society.
I like to speak about what's happening on the streets a little bit, because I've been out on the streets in Richmond, Virginia about 3 times a week for the past month. And what we've seen, one night there were 3 tanks. The Virginia State Police had 3 tanks out. There were dozens of officers with their fingers on the trigger holding automatic weapons. And this was all for 5 of us who were sitting in the median. If you don't know about what's happening in Virginia right now, Governor Northam made this very arbitrary executive order to close down Marcus David Peters Circle, formerly known as the Lee Monument, from sundown until 6 a.m. And so the community has reclaimed that space and just basically stays there every night. There's always vigils going on. It's a sacred space. And so on one particular night that we had 3 tanks out, 2 helicopters flying, the police surveillance craft flying, and officers with their fingers on the trigger, there were only about 6 of us, like maybe 6 sitting out there in that median, not in the closed circle, not in the streets, but sitting in the grassy median where we had been told we were allowed to be. And so this particular night, and I have this on a live stream, so it's public post on my Facebook page, but we were just sitting there, and all of a sudden we see about 100 police officers come rushing through, chasing this one young man. And then we see them tackle him. So at this point, everybody's standing up trying to film, right? And the officers pushed us back and would not let us see what was happening. They would not give us any information. And about 8 to 10 of them actually jumped on top of this one person who they'd been chasing. And this was when they brought out the tanks and the automatic weapons and the National Guard and the Virginia State Police and the K-9 units and everything else for this one person. And so slowly a few other protesters returned to the space, and the police were telling us, you have to get out of here. We're going to arrest you. They're pushing us forcefully. I had bruises on both sides of my ribs that just faded. And this was June 25th. And, scratches on my arms. And that was nothing compared to what other people had. There was a young man who was near me. He was carrying a shield. And the officer gets up in his face and starts saying, you want to hit me? You want to hit me? Go ahead, hit me with that shield. Why don't you hit me? Are you afraid to hit me? Provoking a confrontation. The officer ended up sucker punching this guy, who then lifted his shield in defense and now has a felony charge for felony assault of an officer because of hitting him with his shield after he was being punched. And so this is kind of this is the reality of what's happening in protests. This is the reality of the culture. And I can tell you, with all of these dozens of police officers who were lined up, they were all either actively provoking a confrontation and trying to get us to take an action that would legitimize their use of force, or they were lined up going like this so that we couldn't videotape what was happening and making comments like, well, don't call us when you need help, or we're going to arrest all of you, just basically insulting, intimidating, and very aggressive. And so I thought, as we're talking about the role that police play and how the culture is, the culture of policing clearly creates a scenario in which they're given all of these weapons and they're trying to find reasons to justify their use. That night, as they cleared us out of the circle earlier that evening. We were all moving out of the circle. There was no confrontation happening. And as we moved out of the circle, the space that was closing, police started shooting rubber bullets, unprovoked. And so people were hit. And if you've never seen a rubber bullet, they're about as big as maybe 3 of my thumbs, and they're heavy. And this is what they were shooting at us, along with tear gas, along with pepper spray, along with flash bombs and other forms of ammunition. So this is a very, very violent culture and agency. And that's why there's many of us who say we have to abolish it, because it's violent from its inception, from the roots, from its mission, up through how it's manifested in everyday interaction with the public. So sorry, I took a lot more time than I meant to with that comment.
Thank you, Lana, for sharing. As you recall that narrative, just shaking my head, but also I'm thinking about kind of my own story in terms of growing up in the 90s in urban Chicago and hearing kind of NWA in my ear, but also having these hostile experiences, driving through rural cities or certain neighborhoods and taking long trips and wanting to avoid life-threatening situations by making sure that we kept going and kept straight. So these realities and experiences make me think, do we need the police, or can a broken system be repaired?
Well, I think that. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, Al. Go ahead.
I know that these are tragic circumstances, and I have nothing but, respect for you protesting, and I don't have any desire to defend the police or those police. My own experience is with police who ran into Norris Hall at Virginia Tech in the face of an active shooter. My own experience is with the policeman going to Sandy Hook to try to stop this guy killing 5-year-olds in an elementary school. My own experience is dealing with the police who were traumatized from running into the Virginia Beach Municipal Building and having a shootout in several hallways in the middle of a building. I respect these people because they're trying to, stem the tide of violence and deal with crazy people who are killing a lot of other innocent people. That doesn't mean we don't have many other problems, but that's the police that I deal with. So I'm not at the protests, and I have talked to the police chief in the last 2 days, the new police chief who moved here from Charlotte. He's got a lot of good plans. We got a lot of problems that we need to address. But I want to hold out the nuances here between, all police are bad and we should abolish them, to our culture that has people going into municipal buildings and university lecture halls and elementary schools and shooting people. I mean, we have a crisis at every turn. And the question before us is about what are faithful people going to do? And I think faithful people are called to be with the broken and the hurting, and bring a garland instead of ashes, and try to provide hope and care, and also work for justice. So we got to take both angles on this. That's what I think. We have definite problems in our culture, and you can't excuse these things that are happening, but we also have a lot of other things that are going to need our best gifts at reforming a world that is polluted with people shooting up each other. And I'm not just talking about mass shootings, but the day-to-day shootings that are tearing apart. So just today, the mayor of Atlanta said, it's not the police who are killing people, it's our own people who are killing people, and we got to stop this. So we got a lot of things that we have to address as faithful people.
So Alec, I want to make sure that I add to that. I've had, Lana, your experience. So I want to also say that this cannot change until white people of goodwill, I want to channel a little Edmund Burke, stop doing nothing, presuming that there is a bifurcation in policing, which segregates some good police on this side and some corrupt police on the other side. And I want to kind of echo my own take on your point, Lana, to say that what is the problem is the structural integrity of police as an institution in the country. Because while your experience, Alec, is of police doing those heroic things, and you cannot deny they were heroic, but there are 40 million people minimum in America who experience microaggression and constant anxiety, measurable anxiety from a trauma perspective, and fear and destabilization, instability, I should say destabilization, and aggression, and hidden evil, hidden malfeasance, such as Lana experienced, really impinging on the guaranteed First Amendment right of peaceful assembly and protest. They infringe, as one of the foot soldiers in the Moral Monday movement, behind Dr. Barber, Rodney Sadler and I got arrested the very next weekend, fighting in the capital of North Carolina for basic justice, not even police justice per se, but basic justice, but were stonewalled and mistreated and mishandled by police who were angry enough to take out their frustrations on people just because they differed with them, and they knew that they were protected by qualified immunity. And I'd love to have some conversation about that at some point, which creates a whole nother layer. I am a person who just needs our white family to realize that these complaints and fears are real, and they are not excusable by a few good acts. I think that when priests, for example, molest children, that is not excusable just because I don't. I think that everybody ought to cry loud about that. I think, borrow Dr. Lightsey's term again from the scriptures. I just believe that conversation has to happen, and it has to happen in the context of structural change now, as if a window is open, that if we allow it to close, these things will go back to the shadows where they live.
No, I couldn't agree more with you. And I'm not saying we should excuse anything. I actually think we have the attention of every police department in the country to get a message across. They're listening. I know that's happening in Richmond. Now, we'll see what happens. But I've never seen people ever consider citizen review boards like they are now, or the power of unions and breaking the power of police unions. All of this is on the table now. So I think that's the opportunity that we have to address some of this stuff that you're talking about. It's hugely important.
Alex, I wanted to start by affirming the work that you do, because I believe that without providing trauma care, we would have even more violence from the police. But I also want to push back at the same time, because those officers who have done those heroic acts one day, the next day are standing in riot gear in front of their communities. Because it's a systemic problem. It's not that you have a good officer or a bad officer, although there are definitely bad officers, but it's that they are part of an institution that is built and governed by white supremacy, and the laws that are passed, the people who have had the power to pass those laws, they hold that same, they operate within that white supremacist structure and system. And so the laws that are being enforced are infected with white supremacy. The processes to enforce them are infected with white supremacy. And so the officers that are doing these heroic things, while that cannot be discounted, they are the same people who are then standing against their citizens, the people who are exercising First Amendment rights, or they're pulling over my husband with my kids in the car and 8 of them are surrounding the car because he's brown, or, you know, whatever the case may be. These are the same officers that are then doing these other acts of violence, whether large or small, that terrorize communities. And so that's why I say that it's a systemic or institutional problem, because institutionally, you can have somebody who joined a law enforcement agency with every good intention because they truly wanted to help their community. And maybe they even came from those communities that are riddled with police violence. However, once they are part of that institution, then they have chosen to enforce those laws, whether right or not, whether just or not. And they have chosen to participate in the culture of violence, to line up in riot gear, whether right or not, even if they're the same people who went in and saved first graders from a shooting.
I think the real issue is racism and injustice and oppression, and it's baked into our culture. And we happen to be talking about policing. So, I mean, policing is just the vivid depiction of the larger issue that we're talking about, and it definitely needs.
So I generally have a low anthropology. I admit that. I'm not quite at Calvin's total depravity of a human being, but I have a low anthropology.
You're a Methodist.
Yeah, believe it. And I'm one of those rebels in the United Methodist tradition. But my low anthropology very often points me to looking at the church. And so the question is this is a poignant question before us. And this question is, what is the work of the church in light of everything that we've said about these human beings who are so imperfect and imperfect with weaponry to harm another human being, operating within a system that makes the killing of Black and brown bodies very often legal. I mean, they walk away very often I don't understand I don't understand how you kill another human being and not be impacted by it for the rest of your life. That's another conversation. But to the extent that we're dealing not just with flesh and blood, as the scriptures say, okay, but with principalities, okay, with evil in high places. And I believe that the church must comport itself, not simply to dealing with this low-hanging fruit of imperfect human beings, but the church must comport itself with dealing with the systems and the structures that allow these acts of evil to continue to be perpetrated against other human beings. And if I'm going to be Kingian and think about Martin Luther King, these actions that are perpetrated by other human beings aren't just against other human beings, but it is against the soul of the one who commits them. And so I believe it's the work of the church in light of this. And just I want to go back just a teeny bit, because I don't want to leave without saying this, because Dr. Evans, you invoked Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms and her thing about Black people killing other Black people. I can't quite let that go, because that will for some in the audience, that will give them leeway to talk about the myth of Black on Black crime. And I think Mayor Bottoms was incorrect to invoke that, allow that to kind of float around, because Black people are no more violent statistically against other Black people than white people are violent against white people, because these violent crimes are very personal crimes. So I don't want us to leave without saying that.
So
but
Alec,
that's me with my low anthropology.
So Alec, I want to get to some. Well, first I want to apologize because I allowed emotion to carry me to a place, which I have not done often for years until this season. But anyway, I want to say that what I was hoping to get to, and this is kind of dovetailing Dr. Lightsey, it's a couple of things. One is I'd like to know who that police chief is who just came from Charlotte, because we ain't been too happy with police chiefs for some years here. Anyway, we're not happy with the one we have now. And we live in Charlotte, a place where if you are born poor, in the gleaming buckle on the belt of the Bible Belt, Charlotte, second in banking assets only to New York City, where money hangs literally off of trees. You born poor in Charlotte, you're going to die poor in Charlotte if you're Black. Within 5 miles of the church that I serve, 1/5 of all the homeless children live. And I'm a stone's throw from uptown Charlotte. So my point is that there is somebody, Alec, who has the testimony. My experience of the police are these heroic things offends me because, not that you're not offending me, I'm just saying that testimony being extant in the country offends me because not everybody, not the majority of people can have that testimony, that there are lived experiences which are segregated from that testimony you gave, which is a beautiful thing. I've also seen similar heroism. And so I would say that the church has got to get involved by intentionally, strategically operationalizing theology in ways which value the humanity of every single person, by making first the pronouncement, which has been verboten for 400, really since 1599, 1526, if you get technical, and that is Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, and not apologize and not take down, because some racist elements in our country, including the country's president, have been too ignorant to qualify and to understand the meaning of it and to accept the validity of it, and instead raise up polemics against it as a way of protecting whatever they sense is being threatened. So I just wanted to say that, brother. I'm not trying to vilify police in any respect, in any way, but that testimony exists, not for everybody, is a sin.
Before we go further, I want to say that Dr. Lightsey had to leave for a family emergency, but we're so grateful not only for her presence, but also her contribution to our conversation. We're going to go ahead and wrap things up, but I want to give Alec and Lana another chance, and even Dr. Rary another chance to have a closing comment, and then we'll be ending our conversation tonight and inviting folks to join with us on the second part of this, which is really about reimagining the police. Now that we've discerned and reckoned with the challenges of unjust policing, how do we reimagine policing for our world and also bring this conversation towards action in terms of our churches and communities?
So I think that when we talk about taking action and responsibility of Christian churches, we have a history of being very disconnected from our spirituality as the white Christian church, instead of living an embodied faith. And so I think when we're talking about what our responsibility is, when we talk about repentance, when we talk about the church's role and responsibility, and the fact that the Christian church was very much complicit in forming these institutions of violence, we have to look at tangible, real steps that will be taken to push social change. And so I think, first of all, like, I'm using a frame of repentance here. And when we look at the Hebrew Bible and how repentance is discussed in that context, it starts with going back, recognizing where the damage occurred. And when you go back to that place and you first recognize and you have a reckoning, but then you have to repair it. And part of our responsibility, and I'm talking to you white Christians right along with me, is to dismantle these systems of violence that our ancestors built. It is our responsibility and obligation. And this is not a guilt trip, and it's not shame, because I believe shame is a tool of the devil that moves us to inaction, but this is our responsibility. We did not build those systems, but we did inherit them. And when we look at our choices from day to day, the mystery of faith says that what I did yesterday, I don't have to do tomorrow. It says that our sins have already been nailed to the cross and we can move on as new people. And so as we have this reckoning with the truth, I really want to just push all the white Christian institutions out there to recognize our responsibility because of the role that the church has taken. We have inherited this responsibility, and we can choose with our time, with our money, with our words, with our silence, with our action, with our inaction, with the support that we lend to different spaces. We will drive that change with each and every single one of those decisions, every minute of every day. And so when we look at this through that repentance frame, we start with that reckoning. We move towards reparations, which are tangible and include dismantling systems of violence. And then after reparations are made, then we can begin talking about how to move towards reconciliation.
Reverend Alec?
I feel like we have been in the middle of a storm for a long time, and the intensity has gotten worse lately. Pandemic, polarization, unbelievable stuff from our leadership as a country. It just keeps getting worse. And then the last couple months of these horrific deaths and evidence of brutality and all of that. It's just a swirling, challenging time. The thing that holds me is that God is always in the midst of the storm also. And I think we need to find ways to keep being not afraid, which is what Jesus said in the middle of the storm, and keep living by faith, which is meant to be embodied in discerning ways to do justice, love, kindness, and walk humbly with God. That's what our church is trying to be. That's what all of our churches should be trying to do, finding ways to get to a better side of this storm. And there are lots of levels of this storm. So we have a long way to go and a lot of work to do. And we need to repent. We need to realize that it's fundamentally about racism and systemic injustices, and own it and keep finding ways to get through this. And policing is just one issue in this storm, but an important one. So I want to keep working on all these things and keep urging my congregation to do so as strongly, as effectively as we can. We got a lot of work to do.
Dr. Jones, can I chime in here as well to co-sign what Alec has said and to say, Tim, you know who I'm talking about, Presbyterian scholar and clergyman, the reason for God. He really simplifies the whole matter of atonement, by suggesting if a neighbor runs into the fence post, you can forgive the neighbor, but the cost is still there to fix the fence.
Tim Keller.
Tim Keller, thank you. Had a brain cramp there. So I want to say this, that Lana raised the issue of reparations, which has, like defund the police, become invective in the political discourse. But I agree with what you said, Lana, in that it can be quantified, though it will be difficult and though it will take time. For example, there are whole communities. There's a whole community in Charlotte called Brooklyn that was wiped out, much like the Black Wall Street in Tulsa, wiped out by urban renewal, so they called it. And the value of business is lost, the value of real estate lost, the value of labor forced, the quantifiable aspects of it, and then as well, walking and chewing gum at the same time, focus on institutions which steal Black wealth. Chambers of commerce ought to be held accountable. insurance companies that wrote maps out with red lines on them ought to be held accountable, those that still exist and those that are the progeny of those that did exist. These are moves that will take, though, political will to implement, and only then will real healing begin to happen. Because Malcolm X said this, he said, if you take a 12-inch knife 6 inches out of my back, that's still not equity. No use throwing money at broken schools when the children have begun at such a deficit that $1 million is not going to help. It needs to be targeted, it needs to be intelligently done, and the church needs to be at the vanguard of that movement.
Thank you to our panelists. I want to just end by saying that unjust policing is not a myth, it is a reality. That between 2014 and 2019, roughly 6,557 people died in police custody. Of that number, 25% of those were Black. Their names are Oscar Grant and Aura Rosser, Gabrielle Navarez, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Tanisha Anderson, Akel Garley, Eric Garner, Janisha Fonville, Michelle Cizeau, Freddie Gray, Alton Sterling, Botham Jean, Stephon Clark, Atiana Jefferson, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and so many names that we can't even call them tonight. I say their names because these are real people who have died by police while walking with friends, sitting in front of stores or standing in front of stores, sitting at their TV eating ice cream, sitting in cars, or even sleeping in their homes. These names represent families and communities whose lives ought to have mattered to us and whose blood still cries out to us. When there are knees on necks and communities calling out, literally, I can't breathe, there is a moral imperative for the church to not simply respond, but to release, repent, and to repair what is broken. I think this is an important moment for all of us to do the work of putting an end to unjust policing, but hopefully for us also to reimagine a better future. We invite you here back with us next week as we do the second part of this to talk about reimagining community as well as public safety. Thank you again for joining us tonight.